Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power. Interracial Solidarity in 1960s to 70s New Left Organizing. By Amy Sonnie and James Tracy. Read by Mike Chamberlain. Forward by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I first met representatives of the New Left at San Francisco State College, now University, in the spring of 1961, my first semester there. I was 22 years old, having moved to San Francisco from Oklahoma with my husband. During 1960, my first year living in San Francisco and working full-time in an office machine repair factory, I followed the television images of the burgeoning civil rights movement in the South and all over the country, and I was ripe for recruitment to the movement. In particular, I closely watched the local anti-death penalty sit-ins at San Quentin Prison to prevent the execution of author-inmate Carol Chessman, and followed the student demonstrations against the House Un-American Activities Committee at San Francisco City Hall as police attacked hundreds of students with batons, blasting them with fire hoses and arresting dozens. I wanted to meet those brave young people. I had long hungered to go to college, and now it seemed like a way to get involved with the movement, too. I was thinking less about the risk and more about my excellent typing skills. So, that day on the San Francisco State campus, when I saw an information table about the Mississippi Freedom Rides, I thought, finally! After a full year in San Francisco, this was the first seemingly public invitation to join. Back in Oklahoma, I came from a childhood of rural poverty. For my last year of high school, I moved from the sticks to work full-time in Oklahoma City, which meant I attended the trade high school. Secretarial track, of course. It was the first year of school desegregation in Oklahoma, a year after the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, which ordered the desegregation of public schools. I attended the first public school in Oklahoma to integrate. It was no accident that the single, wholly working-class white school received that honor. Predictably, there were acts of white racist violence against the few black students. I began to pay attention to the sit-ins at local drugstore counters. I read the local extremely right-wing newspaper, because that was the only one available, but the photographs spoke for themselves about the violence being meted out against black people all over the South. Then, I married into a family that abhorred racial discrimination. My father-in-law, a New Deal Democrat, had been a leader in efforts to desegregate the local crafts unions. From my in-laws' point of view, lower-class whites were the racist culprits, the kind of people I came from. I nearly held my breath for 3 years until I could leave Oklahoma and my past forever. I hoped San Francisco would be free of racist, low-class white people. In San Francisco, everything seemed possible. Attending college was a dream come true, and here, during my first semester, I found the noble activists I hoped had all the answers. Without knowing it, they intimidated me to the core. Behind the table sat 2 handsome young white men wearing jeans and plaid shirts. Standing behind them were 2 young women with long, straight blonde hair, dressed in black turtlenecks, skirts, and leotards with shiny black boots. They were all laughing and talking with each other. I felt thrilled, as if a whole new world lay before me. I was also panic-stricken, not knowing what to say. I look back and see, through their eyes, this working-class young woman dressed in the style of the new First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, in a pastel linen shift and matching cardigan sweater with matching purse and medium-high heels, pantyhose, of course, and a bouffant hairdo. And then out came the pronounced Okie accent when she got up the nerve to speak. I fingered a flyer on the table that asked for donations to send Freedom Riders, black and white students on northern buses, to Mississippi to protest segregated interstate transportation. It seemed a brilliant but dangerous program. They also had a sign-up sheet for volunteers. How I wanted to sign! Suddenly, I heard my voice asking if they were going to talk to poor whites in the South. They seemed stunned by the question, perhaps thinking I was joking. But my surely terrified face and trembling hands must have made clear that I was serious, and that I was myself one of the poor whites. Immediately, I wished I could take back the question and start over. Then one of the young men said no, and added that they weren't recruiting them either. It seemed I had spoiled my attempt to somehow join the cause. It took several years before I tried to get involved again. Only after I had successfully gotten rid of my accent, changed my way of dressing, grown my hair long, and driven the working-class rural Okie girl underground in order to be accepted by the movement. My experience is perhaps exceptional, but only because most individuals from my kind of background instinctively avoided putting themselves in positions of such humiliation and rejection. I am glad I persisted in my radical commitment, but the truth is that the movement was, and still is, mired in class hatred. One of my mentors, the late Anne Braden, related to her biographer a new problem facing white organizers who had gone south for the freedom rides and voter registration drives in black communities. Once they were asked to address racism in their own white communities, they balked. They just didn't like white people, said Braden. You can't organize people if you don't like them. Braden thought it was because they had seen so much white violence against blacks and fellow white activists in Mississippi, but I think it was class hatred. As an early leader in the women's liberation movement, I soon felt the same stifling around feminist activists as I did from the young man at that table. I realized that the absence of class consciousness was a fatal flaw of the New Left. I became aware that the experience these now feminist women had gained in the Southern Civil Rights Movement was based on a class privilege that I could not even imagine. Yet this was not the whole story of the movement. It was with great excitement in 1968 that I heard about organizing projects with Appalachian migrants in Chicago, Join Community Union, and the Young Patriots. I spent a few days in August 1969 talking with Peggy Terry, one of the remarkable leaders featured in this book. I had not before met anyone in the movement from a rural, poor white background like mine. Not only that, Peggy originally was from Oklahoma and part Cherokee like me. She opened a whole new world of possibilities for me. Peggy introduced me to one of the young SDS organizers she mentored to show me around the neighborhood. The young white woman, Jerry, impressed me with her organizing skills and her ability to relate to the poor white youth. She seemed to know and be respected by everyone. It was quite a contrast to the SDS project I'd visited in Cleveland, where the SDS organizers seemed completely isolated from the impoverished black community in which they had lived for several years. Jerry took me into a pool hall filled with unemployed young white Appalachians who wore their hair in ducktails and pompadours. I talked to them about their organization, the Young Patriots, and its relationship with the local Black Panther chapter, led by Fred Hampton, who would be murdered by the Chicago police only 4 months later. The young white men were also harassed by the police and had organized neighborhood patrols. To find poor whites organized in an alliance with poor blacks was thrilling. A few months later, I moved to New Orleans to organize poor white and black women into a labor consortium, while my companion at the time worked to set up a Patriots chapter. We invited the Chicago Patriots to send a delegation to help us get started. When William Preacherman Fesperman arrived, he commented, "Who'd ever have thought the Patriots would get hitched to a women's lib outfit? Regular bunch of Mother Joneses. Now don't get me wrong. Wait till you meet my wife. She's a woman's libber all the way." I told Vesperman and the other patriots I met that I objected to their use of patriot, explaining it was reactionary and supported a racist mythology dating back to Andrew Jackson and Indian killing. To me, the very definition of patriotism was patriarchy. I asked if they were teaching their members about past white populist movements in which anti-government sentiments were merged with Jew-hating and racism. They argued that getting the poor white kids hooked up with blacks and Puerto Ricans and Indians dissolved their racism. The historian in me knew that this was the same argument made by the Progressive Party until political expediency became a reason to ignore racism. However, I felt that things might be different this time. The Patriots represented the first poor white organization I knew of who took their cues from black leaders. We organized a meeting of movement organizers, including members of the Republic of New Africa, RNA, for the Patriots delegation. At the time, the New Orleans chapters of the Southern Conference Education Fund, SCEF, and the RNA were working together supporting a strike by pulp mill workers in Laurel, Mississippi, not far outside New Orleans. Virginia Collins, the local RNA leader and one of the organization's founders, told the Patriots about the white and black workers who had been enemies before the strike, but were now working together. She shared that the local Klan actually provided security for the SCEF and RNA organizers when they came to hold meetings, and that sometimes they met in the Black Baptist Church, sometimes in the White Baptist Church. A few weeks later, I visited a new Patriots chapter in Eugene, Oregon, where the members were mostly descendants of migrant Okies, very dear to my heart. I had relatives who worked as loggers in nearby Cottage Grove. I stayed in the Patriots' house, in a rather tense atmosphere, as the police had recently raided it. I stayed up most of the night talking with angry young white men and women whose families had migrated from the Southwest during the Dust Bowl. They were extremely alienated from their families and the rural, poor white culture in which they'd grown up. They were angry that the only work available to their fathers was cutting down the ancient redwood trees. Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son played repeatedly on the stereo. I heard myself, saw myself in them. It gave me hope and a mission, which I have never abandoned, to organize poor whites, however difficult. The men and women we meet in Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power weren't the first working-class radicals to grapple with racism's roadblocks. Hundreds of workers' movements have crumbled because of it. As Karl Marx famously explained, labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin when in the black it is branded. But this insight was not original or new with Marx. It was first enunciated decades earlier by Scots-American socialist, labor organizer, abolitionist, and feminist Fanny Wright in the 1820s, as well as the abolitionists who multiplied a decade later. However, what neither Marx nor the abolitionists, nor later leftists and oppressed nationalities in the United States have fully grasped is the reality of the United States as a colonizing state in which, as historian William Appleman Williams phrased it, empire has always been a way of life. No country has pursued this goal more successfully and ruthlessly than the United States, which, at its founding, announced its intention of conquering and eliminating all the indigenous peoples west from the original 13 states to the Pacific Ocean. The United States spent the next 100 years at war with indigenous nations, thereby building the foundation for the most aggressive and violent military machine in human history. Soon after the founding of the United States, as the Spanish-American colonies became independent republics, the Monroe Doctrine proclaimed the intention of dominating the whole hemisphere. By 1848, half of Mexico was annexed to the United States, which extended economic dominance over the rest of Latin America. These events secured for the settler nation a place among world empires. After World War I, the United States was recognized by the European imperialist powers as an equal, and after World War II, a superior. When we imagine the consequences of this process, it had to be deeply corrupting of the European settler and his descendant, the American settler, so deep it is not even consciously acknowledged or interrogated. White supremacy and empire were normal, and, in this process, generations since its colonial beginnings have been corrupted or confused, often self-hating, not understanding why. Violence resulted at every level, from individual white supremacy to regeneration of the white republic through violence against non-white peoples. The identity politics born in the 60s were just a temporary solution to the burden of the past. Now we are stuck, having played out the multicultural program. All the while, the origin myth of the United States has remained intact, as virginal as the myth created by the colonizers that they were claiming virgin land, unpopulated in its original state. Gone is the truth of vast territories populated and transformed by indigenous farmers for millennia, who built towns and governments, perfected crops, managed ecosystems, fished, hunted, traded, practiced sacred rites. These indigenous farmers were easy to kill by burning or stealing their crops and storehouses of food, or stealing the food. It's always been easy to kill farmers, but until the rise of capitalist-based colonialism, no one wanted to kill farmers, because the farmers fed everyone. Conquerors required tribute in food from the farmers. Yet people still had to eat under capitalism, so the colonizers enslaved indigenous African farmers and brought them in chains to the Americas. They also brought destitute British and European farmers who had been evicted from their farms through the enclosure of the commons. Once the indigenous American communities were reduced or removed, these two groups, poor whites and enslaved Africans, who also intermarried with indigenous individuals, made up the majority of the population of the British colonies in North America. In these 13 colonies, around 20% of the population of 2,780,400 were Africans at the moment of independence. There were 200,000 enslaved Africans in Virginia alone, more than in any of Britain's 22 colonies in the Western Hemisphere. By 1820, an estimated 20% of the 9 million U.S. Anglo-settler population lived west of the Appalachian Allegheny mountain range. By 1860, the U.S. settler population was 30 million, and half of them lived west of the mountains. This was one of the most rapid transfers of human populations in history. But it was not a natural migration. It was government-planned colonization, with indigenous territories cleared of their inhabitants by the military, and settlers given the land, resulting in markets guaranteed to the farmers by the government that was backed by its Navy and Marines. During the 1840s and 1850s, millions of white settlers were recruited to immigrate from Europe and given passage, tools, and land to people the territories taken. Sometimes this process is described as a rush of land-hungry farmers in a democratic setting, forcing their government to destroy indigenous villages and remove the survivors so that white settlers could have land. But that is not how it happened. At the onset of the Industrial Revolution, millions of indigenous Irish fled the famine in their British colonized homeland. The rapid development of industrial capitalism in the United States brought the opening of immigration to Southern and Eastern Europeans, many of them Jews fleeing pogroms and socialists fleeing persecution. Chinese and Filipino males were also recruited as cheap labor. Mostly European immigrants found jobs in urban areas, but many also worked in the mines in remote regions. This period of rapid development during the second half of the 19th century and the formation of a huge immigrant industrial workforce coincided with the wars against the indigenous nations in the plains, and the annexed Mexican territory in the west and southwest parts of the continent. The establishment of the oppressive reservation system on reduced portions of their original territories left the indigenous population living in the conditions of war refugees, totally dependent upon the occupying country. This is the context within which we need to place and evaluate the role of poor whites, white trash, rednecks, crackers, hillbillies, descendants of the original landless and land-poor settlers, the ones that kept moving westward with the United States, squatters sent to fight the native inhabitants. Under Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, the process was institutionalized with the Homestead Act. The small farmers, those frontier trekkers, the foot soldiers of the United States project of imperialism, have been blamed for a lot, but they were not in control of their destinies, although they committed many crimes. They seemed to know it. Those westward pioneers practically drowned with alcohol consumption, the men at least. The men and the women fed their guilt into feverish evangelism, waves of it from the 1790s on into the 21st century with the Tea Party movement. These descendants of the early settlers, those with little or no land or other property, have long been a problem for the U.S. ruling class, while being invisible or a blur to the urban population. Why a problem? They are evidence of the failure of the American dream. The mythology that they have some rights, some prominence in the national story, buys the population's loyalty to the state, even though they have no say in its affairs. They are the people who give the lie to the Jeffersonian ideal of a rural republic of yeoman farmers, of the bootstraps paradigm. They were the foot soldiers of British and United States colonization in North America. They have been the point men on the front lines, killing Indian farmers to take their land, only to be displaced by land companies turning the land into real estate, later coal companies, oil companies, timber companies, agribusiness, cities. The displaced poor whites often moved on to repeat the pattern in Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, parts of Texas, and even the fruit fields and cotton fields of the California Central Valley. The Appalachian poor whites relocated to Cincinnati, Chicago, and other industrial cities for jobs in factories. All along, they have made up the majority of the military, still cannon fodder, but feeling righteous and patriotic. History is made up of stories, but those stories are meaningless or even distorted without an analytical context within which the narrative plays out. Many of the dedicated and brave organizers of the 1960s did not think of their work within this larger historical context, and that remains a fundamental problem today. This essential book documents a moment in time when a group of radical organizers in Chicago, in cooperation with the Black Panther Party and other radicals of color, recognized a revolutionary potential in young, displaced Appalachians and other poor whites descended from the old settlers. These people were the Achilles heel of the U.S. origin myth and the American dream. These organizers attempted, for over a decade, to cut at the tendon of that myth. Given the invisibility of this history, this book couldn't be more timely and more necessary. Poor whites are here today to make ourselves visible to a society whose continued existence depends on the denial of our existence. We are here today united with other races of poor people, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Indians, and black people in a common cause. That common cause is freedom. Peggy Terry at the Poor People's Convention, Washington, D.C., June 19, 1968. Introduction. In July 1969, a dozen self-identified hillbillies showed up to a Black Panther Party conference with Confederate flag patches sewn to their ragged jean jackets. Just above the flag, 3 hand-painted letters identified their radical outfit. YPO, the Young Patriots organization. To outsiders, the Panthers' reputation for self-defense, combined with the very real violence committed under the Southern Cross, might seem to guarantee a nasty brawl. Instead, prominent Panthers welcomed members of the Young Patriots organization like all revolutionary brothers and sisters, with a fist in the air and all power to the people. The Young Patriots had come to Oakland, California, for the United Front Against Fascism conference. They arrived from Uptown, a Chicago neighborhood home to thousands of economically displaced Appalachians, mostly white, who had turned the area into a bastion of Southern culture. Their families had moved north in search of work after mining and agriculture work started to disappear. But only a few found steady jobs. The rest scraped by on day labor, hustling, and domestic work. By one estimate, more than 40% of the neighborhood was on some form of welfare. It was their families the Sunday Tribune had deemed a plague of locusts descending on the city. Yet, Uptown's residents also represent some of the lesser-known protagonists in the 60s New Left. As one Patriots member put it, "We are the living reminder that when they threw out their white trash, they didn't burn it. That trash was picking itself up." The Young Patriots were part of a new trifecta with the Chicago Black Panther Party and a Puerto Rican street gang turned political organization called the Young Lords. Under the banner of the Rainbow Coalition, they formed a vanguard of the dispossessed. While ultimately short-lived, the Rainbow Coalition created by these groups had deeper roots and a longer legacy than even their FBI tailgaters might have imagined. And yes, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had tabs on them from the beginning. This was half the reason they traveled together to Oakland in July 1969. Called by the Black Panther Party, then at the peak of their fame, the United Front Against Fascism conference addressed two urgent concerns: community control of police who were terrorizing poor neighborhoods, and mutual protection against the federal government's escalating attacks on the left. The three-day conference drew more than 2,000 self-styled revolutionaries from across the nation. Black Panthers in their black berets and sleek leather jackets stood shoulder to shoulder with the Young Patriots wearing the flag of the Confederacy. Joining them in the cavernous Oakland auditorium were American Indian activists on the verge of their famous Alcatraz Island takeover, members of the Young Lords flying the bandera of Puerto Rico, Chicano farm workers wearing the Aztec eagle, sympathetic lawyers juggling a full docket of conspiracy trials, more than a few police informants, and members of Students for Democratic Society, SDS, in the middle of a fierce organizational split that led to at least one fistfight before Panther leaders told the factions to freeze on that shit for the rest of the weekend. Outside the auditorium, Panther members and sympathizers watched their kids play, while serious-looking radicals floated in and out, listening to speeches by Panther defense lawyer Charles Gary, Penny Nakatsu, speaking out about internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, City Council member Ron Dellums, and an especially moving message from jailed Panther Erica Huggins, read by Elaine Brown. The Young Patriots' own chairman, William Fesperman, even let some heartfelt gratitude show in between jibes about the pig power structure when he explained how the Patriots came to be at the conference. "Our struggle is beyond comprehension to me sometimes, and I felt for a long time that poor whites was forgotten, that nobody saw us, until we met the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and they met us, and we said, let's put that theory into practice." Summing up why they had all come to Oakland, he added, "We want to stand by our brothers, dig?" For the leftists gathered that July, a life-or-death battle was unfolding. While the depths of the FBI's covert counterintelligence program wouldn't come to light for years, dozens of movement activists had been killed, and others sat in jail facing serious legal charges. Among them, Panthers co-founder Huey Newton, several leaders of the 60s student movement, and renowned icons of the hippie youth counterculture.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?